On a freezing winter night, deep in the heart of the forest, a lone man hears an eerie sound at his door. When he opens it, he doesn't find a stray dog or a passing traveler. He finds a bear. Not just any bear, but one battered by the storm, frost clinging to its fur and desperation in its eyes. What would you do if a creature of the wild turned to you for help? Would you slam the door, or would you take the risk and let it in? This story isn't just about survival. It's about trust, connection, and the unexpected way life sometimes gives us exactly what we need, even when it comes wrapped in fur and claws. The wind howled through the dense spruce and fir trees of the valley, bending their frosted branches into unnatural shapes. Snowflakes, like frozen whispers, spiraled against the log walls of Elliot Ron's cabin. Inside, the dim glow of a cast-iron wood stove cast long, flickering shadows across the room. Elliot sat slumped in an old leather chair, a tattered Nikon D850 camera resting on the table beside him. It had been his lifeline to the outside world since he'd retreated here nearly 2 years ago, capturing the untamed beauty of this isolated patch of Montana near Glacier National Park. The walls of the cabin were adorned with photos: elk grazing in the morning mist, a bald eagle soaring over Lake McDonald, a snow-covered ridge glinting in the weak winter sun. Despite the comfort of the images, the cabin was eerily silent tonight, the kind of silence that pressed on his chest, reminding him of all he'd lost. The sharp crack of ice shifting outside made him sit upright. He glanced toward the frosted window, where shadows played tricks in the dim light, the towering trees shifting with the wind. Then he heard it. An unmistakable sound, a low, guttural whimper, almost like a dog's, but deeper. Elliot's pulse quickened. There shouldn't be anyone or anything this close to the cabin. The nearest road was 5 miles away, and most creatures avoided human habitation during the cold months. He moved cautiously to the window, his breath fogging the glass as he peered into the snowy expanse. At first, all he could see was white, the endless white of winter draped over the earth like a burial shroud. And then, it moved. A large figure, dark against the snow, hunched low near the porch. It was a bear, but not the robust, majestic kind he had seen in summer, lumbering confidently through the forest. This bear was gaunt, its fur clumped with ice, steam rising faintly from its nostrils as it panted heavily. Its front paw pressed awkwardly into the snow. "Jesus," Elliot muttered under his breath. His mind raced. This was a grizzly, Arctos horribilis, a species both revered and feared in these parts. Normally, such a creature would steer clear of humans, especially during hibernation season. But this bear looked desperate, and desperation could mean danger. He grabbed his flashlight from the kitchen counter, clicked it on, and opened the door just a crack. A gust of icy wind rushed in, biting his face. The bear barely flinched at the light, only shifting slightly to meet his gaze. Its eyes, amber pools of exhaustion, stared back at him with an intensity he couldn't ignore. "Are you hurt?" Elliot whispered, as if expecting an answer. The bear let out a low rumble, more a groan than a growl. It lifted its injured paw and limped a step closer, its massive frame sagging under its weight. Instinct told Elliot to slam the door, to lock himself away from this powerful predator. But something about the bear's movements, its labored breathing, stopped him. This wasn't aggression. It was a plea. All right," he muttered, more to himself than to the bear. Grabbing a thick wool blanket, he stepped cautiously onto the porch, his boots crunching in the snow. He stopped just short of the bear, who stood shivering in place. Up close, the animal's condition was even worse. Its coat was patchy, its ribs prominent beneath the fur, frost clinging to its whiskers like tiny icicles. "Let me see," Elliot said, his voice low and steady. The bear shifted its weight, lowering its head as though resigned. That was when he noticed the deep gash on its paw, the skin raw and blackened around the edges, frostbite creeping in. "You poor thing," he murmured, his voice cracking as he wrapped the blanket around the bear's shoulders. It didn't resist, only flinching slightly as the warmth touched its icy fur. With one cautious step at a time, Elliot guided the bear inside the cabin. The heat from the wood stove hit the bear immediately. It collapsed onto the wooden floor with a heavy thud, its breathing labored but steady. Elliot stood frozen, gripping the edge of the table for support. A bear, a grizzly, was lying in his cabin mere feet away, and yet, as surreal as it was, he felt no fear, only an overwhelming wave of pity. Elliot retrieved a first aid kit from a cabinet along with a jar of honey, real Montana clover honey he'd bought from a roadside stand months ago. He set the jar near the bear, unsure if it could eat in its condition. To his surprise, the bear's nose twitched, and with great effort, it licked at the honey, its tongue curling around the jar's rim. "That's it," Elliot murmured. "You'll be all right, we'll figure this out." As he sat down on the floor beside the bear, exhaustion hit him like a tidal wave. But for the first time in years, it wasn't the heavy, suffocating kind of exhaustion that had plagued him since the accident. It was the kind that came with purpose, the kind that made him feel, if only for a moment, alive again. Outside, the wind howled on, but inside, there was only the soft crackle of the fire and the sound of the bear's labored breathing. For the first time in a long while, Elliot didn't feel entirely alone. Lumbering forward, a silent shadow in the twilight, Elliot felt the wind pick up again, carrying with it a biting chill that seeped through even the warmest layers. He adjusted his grip on the cubs, his arms aching, but steady. "Hang on, little ones," he murmured, his breath misting in the frosty air. "We're almost there." The cabin appeared like a beacon through the trees, its soft golden light spilling into the growing darkness. Relief surged through Elliot as they approached, his heart pounding with a mixture of exhaustion and determination. He reached the porch and carefully opened the door, the warmth inside wrapping around him like an embrace. The mother bear hesitated at the threshold, her massive frame silhouetted against the night. Elliot turned to her, his voice low and soothing. "Come on," he said. "It's safe here." She stepped inside cautiously, her claws clicking softly against the wooden floor. Her breath came in slow, visible puffs as she sniffed the air, her gaze darting around the small space. Elliot closed the door behind her, shutting out the cold and the storm that had begun to gather once more. Elliot laid the cubs on a folded blanket near the wood stove, their tiny bodies curling instinctively toward the warmth. He knelt beside them, his hands moving with practiced care as he checked for injuries. One of the cubs whimpered, a small, plaintive sound that tugged at his chest. "They're so cold," he muttered. Glancing toward the stove, he added another log to the fire, the flames crackling and growing brighter. The mother bear settled a short distance away, her weary eyes fixed on her cubs. There was something in her gaze, an unspoken mix of trust and hope, that made Elliot's throat tighten. He reached for an old quilt draped over the back of a chair and gently tucked it around the cubs. Their shivering began to subside, their breathing evening out as the warmth enveloped them. "There you go," Elliot said softly. "You're safe now." The mother bear let out a low rumble, her head lowering to the floor. Elliot glanced at her, his heart aching at the sight of her exhaustion. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The hours passed in a quiet rhythm, the cabin filled with the sounds of the crackling fire and the occasional rustle of the bears. Elliot moved between tending to the cubs and preparing a simple meal of canned soup and crackers for himself. He couldn't help but glance at the mother bear now and then, marveling at the unlikely companionship that had formed between them. When the cubs finally stirred, their tiny noses twitching as they caught the scent of food, Elliot felt a surge of relief. He opened another can of salmon, carefully placing it on a shallow dish. The mother bear nudged the dish toward her cubs, watching as they ate with slow, tentative bites. Elliot leaned against the counter, a faint smile tugging at his lips. For the first time in what felt like forever, the cabin didn't feel empty. As night fell, Elliot sat by the fire, his thoughts drifting like the embers rising from the flames. The events of the past day felt surreal, almost like a story he might have told himself on one of those lonely nights when the silence became too much to bear. He glanced at the mother bear, curled protectively around her cubs, her breathing slow and steady, her eyes closed in what seemed like the first real rest she'd had in days. Elliot felt a pang of admiration for her strength, her determination to keep her family alive against all odds. "You remind me of someone," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. His mind wandered to memories he had tried to bury, of his wife, Claire, and their daughter, Sophie. Claire had been the kind of person who faced every challenge with unshakable resolve, always finding a way to protect the people she loved. Elliot's chest tightened as he thought of Sophie's laughter, the way it used to fill every corner of their home. The cabin had never known that kind of joy, and for a long time, he had convinced himself it never would. But now, as he watched the bear cubs snuggle closer to their mother, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. The night deepened and the forest outside grew still, the storm quieting to a gentle whisper. Elliot sat in the chair by the fire, his camera resting on his lap. He hadn't taken a single photograph of the bears, despite their presence being the kind of moment most wildlife photographers dreamed of. It didn't feel right, somehow, to capture their vulnerability on film. Instead, he simply watched. The mother bear's breathing steadied into a soft rhythm, her cubs nestled against her side. The firelight danced across their fur, painting the scene in hues of gold and amber. It was a picture he would carry in his mind forever, a reminder of the unexpected beauty that could emerge from the harshest of winters. As sleep began to claim him, Elliot whispered into the quiet, words meant for no one but himself. "You saved them, and maybe they're saving me too." The cabin settled into stillness, the warmth of the fire warding off the cold outside, and for the first time in years Elliot closed his eyes with a sense of peace, knowing that in this fragile sanctuary they were safe. For now, Elliot was certain he had heard something, but whatever had caused the sound was now gone. The walk back to the cabin was slower, the air thick with an unshakable sense of anticipation. He couldn't explain it, but something about the forest felt different, as though it were holding a secret just out of reach. The thought lingered in his mind, tugging at the edges of his consciousness. When he returned to the cabin, the golden light of the wood stove greeted him, casting long shadows across the floor. He set the camera down on the table and sank into his chair, staring into the fire. The warmth soothed his aching muscles, but his mind remained restless, replaying the sound he had heard by the stream. That night, Elliot dreamed of the bears. The images were vivid and haunting. The mother bear stood at the edge of the clearing, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resolve. The cubs huddled close to her, their small bodies trembling against the cold. In the dream, she turned to look at him, her gaze piercing through the darkness. There was a message in her eyes, something urgent and unspoken, but before he could understand, the scene faded, leaving him alone in the void. He woke with a start, his heart pounding in the stillness of the cabin. The fire had burned low, the faint embers casting a dim glow across the room. Sitting up, he ran a hand through his hair, trying to shake off the remnants of the dream, but the image of the mother bear lingered, her amber eyes etched into his mind. Rising from his bed, Elliot added another log to the fire, watching as the flames licked hungrily at the wood. The dream had felt like more than just a product of his imagination. It had felt like a call, a reminder that his connection to the bears wasn't over, even if their paths had diverged. As dawn broke, Elliot stood by the window, staring out at the snow-covered forest. The horizon was painted in soft hues of pink and gold, the kind of beauty that had once inspired him to pick up a camera, but this morning, he didn't reach for his Nikon. Instead, he simply watched, letting the quiet fill the spaces within him. And as he stood there, he made a promise, not just to the bears, but to himself. He would honor their story not through photographs but through action. He would continue to care for this place, this fragile piece of wilderness that had given him so much, and perhaps in doing so he might find his own way back to the life he had left behind. The echo of their footsteps might fade, but the memory of their time together would remain, a quiet reminder of the bonds that could form in the most unexpected of moments. The days turned to weeks, the harsh winter loosening its grip on the valley. The snow began to recede, revealing patches of brown earth and the skeletal remains of fallen leaves. The air, though still cold, carried the faint promise of spring, a subtle shift that whispered of renewal and change. Elliot's routine remained simple, splitting firewood, checking the generator, preparing meals. Yet something inside him had shifted. The cabin, once a fortress against the world, now felt like part of a larger story, one that extended beyond its walls and into the forest that surrounded him. One crisp morning, as Elliot prepared to head into the woods with his camera, movement in the distance caught his eye. Through the window, he saw a dark shape emerge from the trees, a familiar lumbering form that made his breath catch. The mother bear. She stood at the edge of the clearing, her head held high as she surveyed the cabin. Her fur, once matted and patchy, had regained its luster, and her injured paw, though still slightly stiff, bore her weight with ease. Behind her, two smaller shapes appeared, the cubs, darting in and out of the shadows, their playful energy unmistakable. Elliot's heart swelled as he stepped outside, his boots crunching softly against the snow. He stopped a respectful distance away, not wanting to intrude. The mother bear watched him, her amber eyes calm and steady. For a moment they simply stood there, two figures bound by a shared history. Elliot raised his hand in a small wave, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they had forged. The mother bear let out a low, rumbling huff, her gaze lingering on him before she turned back toward the forest. The cubs followed, their tiny paw prints crisscrossing in the snow as they bounded after her. Elliot watched until they disappeared into the trees, his chest tight with a mixture of joy and melancholy. He knew this was how it was meant to be, the bears returning to the wild where they belonged. Yet the sight of them, healthy and thriving, filled him with a quiet pride. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Elliot sat by the wood stove with his notebook. The pages were filled with sketches and notes, observations he had jotted down over the years. But tonight, he began something new. The first line came slowly, the words carefully chosen. This winter, a mother bear and her cubs found their way to my door, and in helping them, I found my way back to myself. The writing flowed from him, a stream of thoughts and memories that poured onto the page. He wrote about the storm, the fragile trust that had formed between them, and the journey to the frozen stream. He wrote about the quiet moments by the fire, the cubs nestled under the quilt, and the way the mother bear's eyes seemed to hold unspoken truths. For the first time in years, Elliot felt a sense of purpose beyond his own survival. The story wasn't just about the bears. It was about resilience, connection, and the unexpected ways life could heal even the deepest wounds. Spring arrived with a burst of color, the valley coming alive with the songs of birds and the gentle hum of bees. The forest, once stark and white, now bloomed with wildflowers and fresh greenery. Elliot spent more time outside, his camera in hand, capturing the transformation. One afternoon, while walking along the stream, he found himself drawn to the clearing where he had last seen the bears. The snow had melted, revealing soft grass and scattered patches of moss. He stood there for a long moment, his heart full as he imagined the bears moving through the forest, free and untethered. He set his camera down and closed his eyes, letting the sounds of the wilderness wash over him, the rustle of leaves, the distant chirp of a bird, the soft murmur of the stream. They all seemed to echo with the same message: life goes on. The cabin, once a place of isolation, had become a sanctuary, not just for the bears but for Elliot himself. He still carried the weight of his past, but it no longer felt as heavy. The memories of Claire and Sophie, once painful reminders of what he had lost, now felt like threads woven into the fabric of his life, a part of a story that continued to unfold. Elliot sat on the porch one evening, the horizon painted in hues of gold and lavender. A journal rested on his lap, its pages filled with sketches and words that captured the essence of the winter he would never forget. He turned to a blank page and began to write. We are all connected in ways we may never fully understand. In helping a mother bear and her cubs, I found something I thought I had lost forever. A reason to hope, a reason to heal. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Elliot closed the journal and looked out at the forest, a faint smile on his lips. For the first time in years, he felt ready to face whatever lay ahead, not as a man defined by loss, but as someone who had rediscovered the quiet beauty of connection and resilience. And as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, he whispered to the night, a promise carried on the wind. Thank you. Through the harsh winter and the bond between man and beast, we've witnessed a story of resilience, trust, and the quiet power of compassion. Sometimes the most unexpected encounters can lead to the greatest transformation. Elliot thought he was saving the bears, but perhaps they were the ones saving him.